So it's my sincere pleasure to welcome our next speaker to the day. Other than listening to a panel of students around student learning, the next best thing in terms of wisdom about thinking about student learning, I can't think of a better person than Andrew Delbanco to join us today and share his thoughts. He was intending to be here in person. He's based in New York, and due to a respiratory infection, we all thought it was wise that he join remotely to not create anxiety on the flight with the passengers next to him. Andrew Delbanco is the president of the Teagle Foundation. The Teagle Foundation, if you don't know it, in my opinion, has done the most of any private foundation to promote the issue of student learning over the past couple of decades. He is also the Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies and winner of the Great Teacher Award from the Society of Columbia Graduates. He's the author of College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be, Melville, His World and Work, The Death of Satan, Why Our American Classics Matter Now, The Real American Dream, The Puritan Ordeal, and most recently this year, The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for the American Soul. He received both his BA and his PhD from Harvard University. His essays appear regularly in the New York Review of Books and other journals on topics ranging from American literary and religious history to contemporary issues in higher education. In 2001, he was named by Time magazine as America's best social critic, and that same year was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In February 2012, President Barack Obama presented Professor Delbanco with the National Humanities Medal for his writings on higher education and the place classic authors hold in history and contemporary life. We are very grateful that he's joining us today and speaking on the topic, why confusing our students can be a good thing. Professor Delbanco.
Thank you very much, Richard. First things first, are you actually able to hear me?
Yes.
Looking for nods. I can see you, and I can see a small image of, okay, I'm seeing some nods. So the audio is working okay. Let me begin with first thanks to Richard and Michael for inviting me to participate today, and also apologies that I'm not there with you in person. As Richard mentioned, I had a rather messy cold/flu earlier in the week, and as much as I would like to come out there, I didn't relish the idea of getting quarantined at Los Angeles airport for a couple of weeks. So thank you for bearing with me, and we'll make the best of this technology. Now I have to say, unfortunately, the audio for me, that is, coming from you, has not been great. So unfortunately, I haven't really had a chance to hear very much of what's been said up till now. And I regret that because I'd like to be responsive to what the earlier speakers and students said. But I hope you can hear me, and I hope we'll be able to have some functional Q&A for a few minutes after my remarks. I should say, too, that this is my inaugural journey on Zoom. One of its advantages, I think, is, as far as I know, the coronavirus cannot be transmitted over Zoom, and neither can the common cold or anything else. So we're all safe from one another. Let me begin by saying that when Michael asked me to join the conversation today, I had the idea of offering a sort of provocative title for my remarks. That is to say, why it might actually be a good thing to confuse students. And probably doesn't really need me to say this, but I'm obviously coming from a somewhat different place than many of you and the previous speakers. I'm a student of literature and history, so I'm speaking from the perspective of a humanities scholar and teacher, and I hope that that will be a useful one to add to this conversation. Now, we can all agree, I'm sure we do all agree, that we want students to learn how to think and speak with clarity, and I'm not objecting to that in any way. But I think we might also agree that clarity and certainty are qualities that we might have a little bit too much of these days in our public discourse, particularly our political discourse. And that we might be able to use a bit more sensitivity to ambiguity, contradiction, or what might be grouped under the rubric of nuance. Those, at any rate, are among my aims in the classroom. And my premise in the classroom, as I'm sure yours is too, is that one of the main aims of college education is to help prepare young people to be citizens. And that's a charged word in today's political context. I don't mean by it, narrowly speaking, people with legal status of citizens, though I wish all of our students were eligible for that status. But I mean more broadly, to prepare them to be informed participants in a democratic society. What I want to suggest to you is that in some respects, a good citizen is a confused citizen. That is a person who is wary of ideologues or demagogues who peddle simple answers to complicated questions, whether those answers come from the right or the left. And I hear, and I don't think what I'm about to say will be very controversial to many of you, that we live at a time when we're assaulted by simple, presumptive answers. You either think that the market, the free market, can solve all problems. The good ideas rise and bad ideas fall, and if capitalism entails what the great historian Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, well, then so be it. Some people will lose their jobs, people will have to move, and our society needs to be the dynamic society fostered by a free enterprise and unregulated capitalism. Other people think the market is the problem, that all things bad in our society stem from the unregulated market, and that the market cannot be understood as having any conception of the public good. And we therefore are less able to address common problems because sometimes the solutions to common problems are not necessarily profitable or beneficial to investors. In politics, you're either for central planning and redistribution. Some people call that socialism or democratic socialism, or you're for allowing the capitalist system to operate unfettered, that people will find their destined place in our society and all will be well in the end. Even in the realm of private life, I'm going to go very briefly to the charged topic of sexual behavior, which has been an important issue on our campuses, I don't need to remind you. You either believe that there's coercion or consent, and that there's nothing in between. I could go on with this list of binaries, as I suppose some people call them, but I would think that you get the point. That it seems to me that on all of these issues, we would be better off if we could have a conversation about the possibility that these issues are more complicated, and that, as the cliche goes, the truth might lie in the middle, or at any rate somewhere between the extremes. that we would be better off with less certainty, less dogmatism, less ideological purity on these kinds of issues, and more flexibility of mind, or what I'm calling, the purposes of provocation, confusion. So that's all by way of a brief overture to what I want to talk about. And my question for the next 40 minutes or so will be, roughly speaking, how are we doing at achieving this goal through our institutions of higher learning, which I would like to believe are places where we can tolerate a more complex discourse, a discourse that has more room for nuance and points of view along the spectrum between the right and the left, a place where we hope students and faculty don't demonize one another according to what they believe, but are willing to listen to one another in the hope of learning from one another, which is part of what the college idea, in my view, is all about. So a few sort of elementary observations in response to that question. If we sort of scan what we might call the landscape of opportunity that higher education represents, I'm afraid that we will see an allocation of resources that doesn't look all that different from the rising problem of inequality by which our society is plagued. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me give you a few for instance. The four most heavily endowed private universities in our country, namely Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale, have a combined endowment of roughly $125 billion. Now, after the market turmoil of the last couple of weeks, it might be a little lower than that, but it's still in that range. You have to go down the list. You have to go down 15 more institutions and add them all up together before you arrive at a total that approximates that number. 95% of American colleges and universities have less than 1% of Harvard's endowment. In short, the picture of higher education closely resembles the picture of our society, in which a very small number of individuals or institutions have an enormously disproportionate command of resources, and that a much larger number must struggle in this free-for-all economy of ours. Now, that's just about private, nonprofit institutions of higher learning. I don't need to tell you, as students and faculty at the University of California, that there's been a disturbing, alarming, and in some cases devastating trend of public disinvestment from public higher education going back around 40 years. I'm afraid there's an argument that that trend began in your state with the Proposition 13 back in 1978, a trend that has meant that public institutions have had to redefine or reconceive the meaning of what it means to be a public institution. They have to look out of state for students who will bring in more tuition revenue. They have to look internationally, out of country, for students who will bring in more tuition revenue. And there's nothing wrong with having diversity of students that includes international students and students from out of state, but it does present us with a challenge as to what the mission and what the responsibility of public institutions are in our country. We go back to the privates for a moment, or we compare the privates and the publics. I'm just throwing a few numbers out to try to illustrate the general point, and I'm not a numbers guy, so these numbers may be challenged during the Q&A. If you look at the richest institution, which is actually Princeton, if you calculate endowment per student, Princeton probably spends something north of $100,000 per undergraduate student. Now that means that every student at Princeton is actually subsidized by the institution. Even those who are paying the so-called full freight, which is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about $70,000. By contrast, a typical student at a community college, a public two-year institution, is at a place that can afford to spend somewhere, let's say, between $10,000 and $15,000 per student. If we think about that, one could venture the generalization that the most affluent students, by and large, in our country, are receiving the greatest subsidies and supports, and the most vulnerable students, including disproportionately first-generation students, children of immigrants, students of color, are receiving the least amount of resources and the least amount of support. I think it would be hard to argue that that's a picture of a just society, but it is a picture of our society. Another statistical snapshot, about 80% of students attending two-year public community colleges have the hope, the aspiration of attaining a four-year bachelor's degree. Only about 13% of those students actually attain that degree. And those are numbers that tell us that there are a lot of disappointed young and not so young people in our country who are not being served as well as they should be by our higher education system. And there are many more numbers that I could cite. For example, the study by the Stanford economist Carolyn Hoxby and colleagues from a few years ago that every year somewhere between 35 and 40,000 high-achieving low-income students never apply to a selective college or university, largely because they don't know that financial aid is available to them and that they would have a realistic shot of being admitted by such an institution. So those are just a few spotlights on what I might call the opportunity landscape. And I would pause for a moment before going on to the second point I want to make, to say that, as Richard mentioned, I recently put on a new hat. That is the hat as the president of a small foundation, legal foundation, that's dedicated to supporting liberal education in colleges and universities. There's not much a foundation like mine, or indeed of any size, can do about any of these problems that I've just enumerated. These are public policy problems. These are political problems. These are problems that require a shift in the national consensus about what matters and what investments are important for us as a society to make. But they are worth noting, nevertheless, whether we can do much about them in the short term or not. Now, second point or second question. What about those students who do get to college and even get through college and come out with a degree? How much are they learning? In particular, how much are they learning that will serve them toward this goal that I mentioned at the outset of becoming informed, active, engaged citizens with flexibility of mind, capacity for what is often called critical thinking. Frankly, I've never quite understood the distinction between critical thinking and just plain thinking. But be that as it may, I think we know what it means. Well, now, Richard, the dean of your education school, is an authority on this question and is the co-author of two very sobering books that suggest that students are learning, if not very little, much less than they should be in our colleges and universities. And moreover, he and other scholars have suggested that particularly low-income students, first-gen students, are the most vulnerable to what another scholar has called the implicit agreement between the university and students to demand little of each other. That's a problem that I think colleges and universities can do something about. I suspect it's not a significant problem at UC Irvine, but it is a problem on many campuses across our country, and one that we should not be complacent about. We know the discouraging graduation rates, that is that fewer than 60% of students in public institutions attain graduation within 6 years. And we know all kinds of anecdotal stories about students coming out, even those who do obtain the degree, unprepared for the challenges of post-college life. Now, here too, there is a gross disproportion between the size of the problem that I've just described and the resources of the very small foundation that I have the honor of leading at the moment. And yet we do believe, and I'm not trying to present an infomercial here for the Teagle Foundation, I'm just trying to talk about the efforts that I know something about. We do believe we can do something about these problems. So for instance, we have made a grant to a very large institution, Georgia State University, where they are employing innovative digital means to, as a kind of early warning system when students get into academic difficulty, so that, and they have developed a program of freshman learning cohorts so that students arrive at the university and don't disperse at random into large classes without, recognizing their classmates and with a sense of being anonymous in a very large environment, but rather they get to know their peers. They get a sense that teachers know who they are and know when they are running into difficulties, and are attentive to their needs. And we think that those kinds of interventions can make a big difference. We've also made a grant to San Francisco State University. One thing that these two institutions have in common is inspired leadership. At Georgia State, President Mark Becker is a far-sighted leader, and at San Francisco State, the provost there, Jennifer Summit, who some of you may know, is also a visionary leader. We think leadership matters, and we think that one characteristic of good leadership is that it cares about what happens to students. Among the innovations, it's sort of striking to think that these are innovations. Among the innovations at San Francisco State is the idea that, well, faculty ought to make sure that courses that are required of students are actually available to students. That is, that faculty should teach the classes that students must take in order to make progress in their majors, rather than the courses that the faculty particularly might want to teach, where enrollments might be small and the benefit to students may be smaller. There's also another pretty elementary principle that we should put our best teachers in the classroom for introductory classes. Teaching the introductory class should be an honor and a serious responsibility, rather than something that we shuck off onto faculty who just, feel like they have to do what they're told. And that we should take advising seriously. That as a faculty responsibility and as an institutional responsibility, students should be able to count on good and informed advice about how best to make progress toward completing the degree and completing the major. Now, third point, and sort of the broadest scale set of questions I want to ask before I conclude my, I hope not incoherent remarks, and turn to you for questions that I hope I'll be able to hear. How are our institutions doing, broadly speaking, in the context that I've just described? And I'm sorry to be sort of dark about the way I'm painting this picture. How are we doing at cultivating the qualities that I've subsumed under the category of informed citizenship? Well, let me roll out a few quotations that might suggest where the answer lies. Here, from a book written more than 15 years ago, 2003, by the former president of Harvard, Derek Bok, is the following statement. Faculties currently display scant interest in preparing undergraduates to be democratic citizens, a task once regarded as the principal purpose of a liberal education and one urgently needed at this moment in the United States. Now that was Derek Bach in 2003. A rather startling statement if you think about it, because it seemed to me anyway that he's talking about one of the primary dimensions of the mission of higher education. He makes that statement, and moreover, he makes it in a footnote. Appears in a footnote in his book, rather than as a headline, which I thought it might have been. Now here is the same author, Derek Bach, who is sort of resilient and an optimistic person, but here he is 14 years later saying, quote, very few colleges prescribe even a single course to prepare students to be active, knowledgeable citizens. Single course to prepare students to be active, knowledgeable citizens. Now, we could have a discussion about that, and I think there's a case to be made that you don't become an active, knowledgeable citizen through any particular course, a requirement in citizenship learning or the history of the Constitution might not be the remedy that we're looking for, that citizenship is a broader concept and that college is a broader experience than just the classroom. It's useful to remind ourselves that students like you, I'm looking at on my screen, spend a great deal more time out of the classroom than in the classroom. So it could be that, just talking about prescription and curriculum and courses is maybe not the right way to go. But nevertheless, it's worth noting that I think what Mr. Bach says is accurate. Now here's another quotation. This one I scribbled down from a conversation on the morning television show Morning Joe, as some of you may watch on MSNBC. And they had a couple of also Harvard professors, co-authors of a cheerfully entitled book called How Democracies Die. They weren't saying exactly that they think our democracy is dying, but they were sounding the alarm that we ought to be attentive to the reality that democracies do sometimes die, and we don't want that to happen to ours. So here's one of the authors. He says, we need robust, vigilant citizens. And so I really think there needs to be a renewed attention to this kind of feature of education to really protect our democracy. In response to which, a couple of the regulars on the show, you watch it, Mike Barnacle, a newspaper columnist from Boston, says to these two gentlemen on the faculty, he says, well, both of you teach at Harvard. He said, I would bet you if you walked off of Massachusetts Avenue into the Harvard campus and talked to any number of students, maybe a majority would have no idea who George Marshall was. Now, I'm not quite sure why Mike Barnacle picked George Marshall as the test of citizenship awareness, but he was a pretty important guy. I mean, he was the major figure in the period of the Second World War and the architect of the Marshall Plan that historians believe did a great deal to save Western Europe from falling under the domination of the Soviet Union in the middle of the 20th century. So it's probably true that Americans should be aware of who he was. Then Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, joined the fray and going after these two faculty members from Harvard and says, so what odds would it be that the Harvard faculty would support a required course so that every graduate would have to study about American civics? Would you guys be able to get that course through your own faculty? Would the faculty approve of such a requirement? And the response was from one of the authors, well, I would be in favor of it. And then the other one was a little more candid and said, it would be a tough haul. In other words, in today's atomistic academic culture, and there are good reasons for this, with highly specialized and fragmented knowledge in which all faculty feel that their own specialty is extremely important. That's what they want to teach. That's what they want students to learn. It's very unlikely that faculty would come to a consensus about certain things that all students should be asked to think about in the course of their college education. And that's just conceding what the reality is. Now, so those are some of the realities that I think, there may be disagreement in the room. That I have mischaracterized them or distorted them or exaggerated them. And of course, there are a lot of good things to be said about America's colleges and universities. If I didn't think that were true, I wouldn't have spent my life teaching in a couple of them. But I do believe that I have told it kind of like it is. And so the question is, what kind of response should be forthcoming, at least from those of us who are concerned about these issues? And I want, again, not in the spirit of advertising the work of the Teagle Foundation, but this is the work I know, and I think it's relevant to this conversation, to give you one example of an initiative that we believe in very strongly, that we've been supporting, that I think speaks to these issues. So it happened on the campus of Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana, a place that I've actually never been. So I have no, special interest in advertising the virtues of Purdue. But let me tell you what happened there and what is happening there, and I'll be interested in your thoughts about it when we get to the interchange. So a new dean arrived at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Purdue. Purdue is a very distinguished institution with a strong STEM emphasis, with schools of engineering and technology, and a very, very strong interest among its students in the STEM fields, which is, I suspect, true at Irvine and many other institutions, in fact, at almost all institutions now in the United States, if not exclusively in the STEM fields, then in other fields of study that are very directly connected to career opportunities after college, whether they be business or health science or artificial intelligence, computer programming. These are the growth fields. And there's nothing wrong with that. Right? Colleges and universities need to be responsive to the culture where the energy is, where the action is. Young people are excited about the future. These are fields that are future-oriented, and I'm not here to be the curmudgeonly humanist who says, I want everybody in college to spend their time reading Shakespeare and the romantic poets and not worrying about how to make a living when they get out of college. That would be ridiculous. Still, when this dean arrived at Purdue, he took a look around and did some number crunching, and discovered that roughly 10% of the graduates of the university had taken a single course in literature, and fewer than 10% had taken a single course in American history. Now, this dean thought to himself, that's not okay. It's not okay to give a bachelor's degree, whether it's a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science, to students who have had no engagement with the issues that are raised in works of literature. And I'll say a little bit later on of what some of those issues might be. Or to give a bachelor's degree from an American institution of higher education to students who have no real conception about the contours and the major issues and conflicts in the history of our own country. Now, we could say, well, they're supposed to learn that in high school, and that's sort of true, but I think we would be fooling ourselves if we imagine that most entering college students have had an adequate preparation in history through high school. So this dean turned to a member of the faculty who he knew or just gotten to know in the history department, a mid-career historian, a woman, a historian of women's history in early modern Britain, who had been noticing that her classes in the history department were getting kind of, they weren't empty, but they were thinning out. And that the majors in the humanities there, as in almost all institutions, were radically declining. So she went over to the general education folks. And I don't know what the general education program at Irvine looks like. I should have informed myself before this, and I apologize for not doing that. But at Purdue, as at many places, there are sets of distribution requirements that students have to meet in general education. You know, a course in the natural sciences, a course in social science, a course in the humanities, and a university-wide requirement, which I think they call oral and written expression. Some places call it composition. Some places call it simply writing. A course where you're supposed to learn how to write clearly, how to make arguments in written form, and to defend your point of view with evidence, all of which are worthy goals. So she went over there and she said, listen, if I bring to you a two-course sequence called Transformative Texts, by which she meant books, she didn't call them great books as they are sometimes called, or classics as they are sometimes called, but transformative texts, meaning books that have had a significant impact on individuals over a long period of time and on society and culture over a long period of time, whether the impact is positive or negative. Books from which some of the basic ideas around which we organize our society arise. Ideas like the rule of law, civil liberties, individuality, social responsibility, distribution of power, the ideas that are real in our lives every day, whether we recognize them or not. So she said, if I bring you a course where students have to read a selection of such books, and it's taught by real faculty, the tenure faculty and tenure track faculty, in small, relatively small classes of about 30 students each, would you give those students credit for the oral and written expression requirement? They would, of course, be writing papers, and they would be learning how to make oral and written arguments in these classes. So the general education people said, yeah, sure, why not? Sounds okay. I sometimes suspect that the deans in the room and others who know how universities work, I sometimes suspect that they said that to her because they figured they'd never see her again, because most faculty show up once and then don't show up a second time. But in this case, they were wrong, and she went back first to the English department, and then to history, political science, sociology, philosophy, classics, and she went to these departments, and she said something more or less like, I mean, I'm caricaturing the dialogue, but not too grotesquely. He said something like, hey, you may have noticed you don't have any students. That is, there are no majors in your department to speak of, and your seminars are so small that some of them are being canceled by the administration because it doesn't make sense to offer classes where there are only 2 or 3 students. So how would you like to come over to the general education program, teach these first-year incoming students these transformative texts? And she said, I've got a list. We have a committee of faculty that pulled together a list, about 150 books from Plato and Homer, all the way up to Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and we'd like you to pick half the books from this list, and the other half you can pick from books that you're excited about, books that got you excited to come into academia in the first place. And the faculty said, yeah, okay, we'll give it a try. So they did, and to cut to the chase, long story short, 3 years later, only started 3 years ago, 2,000 incoming first-year students at that particular university are enrolled in this course called Transformative Texts. something like 25% of the incoming class. It's a large institution, at 8,000 students coming in each year. What that says to me is that students, I don't mean to preach to this group, because I believe there are students sitting in those green seats that I'm looking at through my computer screen, and I don't mean to tell you what you think or what you feel, but it does seem to me that young people, at least all the young people I know, or the young person I remember myself as having been, are concerned with the questions that are raised in the kinds of books that Professor Zook, her name is Melinda Zook, was talking about, and which she has now made a central part of the curriculum at her institution. What is literature about, after all? Literature tends very often to be about people in conflict with themselves. People asking hard questions about what's the right way to live. How wealthy can I get and still live with myself if it's at the expense of other people? What's the distinction between love and desire? Or is there a meaningful distinction that I should be concerned about in my private life? Where does my responsibility for other people begin? And where does it end? Does it end with my immediate family, my closest friends? Does it extend to my community, local, national, global? These are among the questions that the kinds of books that she's talking about raise. The authors of those books come to very different conclusions about those questions. And one of the things one learns in a class like the one she proposed is how to listen respectfully to people who have different answers to such questions and think about them and remain open in your mind and heart to answers that you may not have considered before you got to college and before you encountered books, teachers who care about the books and who care about you, and other students who come from very different backgrounds from your own and who may have different responses to the same text that you're reading. That, to me, is a critically important function of our colleges and universities, and if we meet that obligation to our students, we will confuse them. And that's what I meant by my slightly cryptic title. We will confuse them in a good way, because hard questions do not have easy answers. And you have to go through a process of reflection and self-interrogation before you get to an answer that feels satisfying even to yourself, if you are a thoughtful, reflective person, which is what we hope college graduates will be. College graduate, it seems to me, and I'm almost at the end of these remarks, college graduate ought to be someone, for instance, who can come to terms with the fact that, for example, Thomas Jefferson was a racist in the basic sense of the word. He believed, or at least he seriously considered, that there were intellectual and emotional innate distinctions between people of different races. And he strongly suspected that white people were superior to black people. He held odious views on that subject. And yet, he was also a radical Democrat and the author of our Declaration of Independence and of the Bill of Rights in a significant degree, designed to protect the rights of individual citizens from tyrannical governments. Rights which we are still struggling today to grant in a full sense to all members of our society, including members of ethnic and racial and religious groups whom Jefferson may have thought didn't deserve those rights. So we need to be able to think in a nuanced and complex way about a figure like that if we're going to have any kind of productive relationship to our own history. And I say our history because Americans do have a common history, whether they like it or not. And all things considered, it seems to me a good idea that we should be more rather than less aware of it. Or how, just one other quick example, how could it be that Edith Wharton was both a great novelist and an anti-Semite? How can that be? To sum it up, I'll leave you with a favorite remark of mine that comes from an essay by Scott Fitzgerald, in which he makes the following somewhat famous statement. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Okay, the capacity to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time. Like Jefferson was a racist, but Jefferson was also a great Democrat, and still retain the ability to function as a citizen of the United States of America. I'm adding those words to Fitzgerald's words. That's a pretty good description of what I think of as the goal of a college education. It's not maybe everybody's idea of what the goal should be. In fact, I know it's not everybody's idea of what the goal should be, but I think it's an important one. And I think we should be asking ourselves, and I didn't mean by saying, hey, look what they're doing at Purdue, look what we're supporting at Teagle. I didn't mean to say, please get on it at Irvine and do the same thing starting tomorrow morning. Every institution has its own traditions, its own structure, its own culture. I understand that. But I do think all of us as educators and as students who take our education seriously ought to be thinking about these questions, both about the opportunities that are or are not available to our fellow citizens and about how to make the best of the opportunities that are available to us. So I will stop with that. Thank you very much. I hope you could hear me. I fear that you could probably see me. I am now happy to take any questions as long as the technology cooperates. Thank you.
I might take the first question, Andrew, and then people can, I think we'll have better luck if we speak directly into the microphone. Can you hear me, Andrew?
I can, Richard, in my experience, speakers would stay as close as possible to the microphone.
Okay, very good, very good. So you spoke very eloquently about the importance of intellectual virtues as well as civic education, and then spoke to some examples in the humanities for training and developing those abilities and competencies. I was wondering, is it something about the content of those subjects that lend themselves to that task, or is there something about the pedagogical approach that's found more often amongst in humanities classrooms that lends itself again to training these intellectual virtues and promoting civic education?
Well, it's a powerful question, and I'm not super well situated really to answer it because it's really the humanities that I know, and I know science is only my hearsay, because I'm a pretty good example of an effective college graduate, and my training in the natural sciences is pretty minimal. But let me say a couple things nevertheless. Look, the points I was stressing are, like I said, points that belong in a certain way to such subjects as literature and history, philosophy, where we encounter problems of human responsibility and behavior and choices that people are faced with, either fictional characters or real historical actors who could have, at the time of the Second World War, our nation could have decided to stay out of it, leave it to the Europeans to settle their quarrel. In fact, under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, we decided to get into it. Was that the right decision? How do such decisions get made? What are the processes by which a society reaches such a conclusion? These are the kinds of questions that belong to certain subjects, and those subjects do, broadly speaking, fall under the rubric of the humanities. But if we move out toward the question of how to teach, what are the more effective teaching methodologies, then I think we arrive at certain points of continuity and connection between the humanities and all other subjects. Active learning, for example. Despite the weak audio that I was dealing with, I could hear a number of the earlier speakers speaking about the virtues of active learning. And I would strongly agree with that. Now, that's one reason that I'm a skeptic about the power of distance learning, particularly in the MOOC form that seems to have simmered down a little bit in the humanities. Lectures, performances, whether they're in person or remote, tend to be things that we absorb passively. We enjoy them, we're bored by them, we're excited by them, but they don't put a lot of pressure on us to respond through active intellectual engagement. So active learning was the principle that a guy named Socrates employed in the dialogues when instead of making speeches or sermons, he asked questions. He asked questions because he wanted the person he was talking to think about what they thought they believed. And as far as I know, the best science teachers are great askers of questions. And will probe and pose challenging questions to their students. Some of the very best teachers have found ways to do that even in large classes, lecture form, so that students have to engage actively with the material. And only through that, and the psychologists have studied this, and I believe you had some commentary about that earlier in the day, to suggest that the brain itself functions in such a way that unless it is provoked to thinking in this sense of the word, the learning will come and the learning will go, and it won't have lasting. So I'm a big believer in active learning and in any pedagogy that can stimulate active learning. I also, there are some fields, no doubt, where there are more likely to be cut and dried right or wrong answers to certain problems, and in the humanistic field. But we tend to overestimate that, I think. The economists certainly don't seem to be able to agree on what the right and wrong answers are to complex problems. And I don't believe the scientists agree about it all the time either. So they have a better track record of testing answers to see whether truth claims can be replicated than we do in the humanities. So there are differences, but there are commonalities. And I don't want to go on and on, but I hope that goes to some part of the question.
We probably just have time for one more question before the break.
I hate the idea that I've left you all speaking.
Okay, I think we might go straight to the break then. Andrew, we're very grateful that you've navigated this difficult format. As you probably heard the news earlier today, the University of Washington has moved online, and probably many other institutions to follow. And so given your deep concern around student learning, this is probably a good inaugural experience for you in interacting with us. Thank you very much for your comments and sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.